Well, there's certain chapters we imagine unfolding in a particular way in our lives. Marriage, children, building a home together, perhaps even growing old side by side. But life, as we know, doesn't always follow the script. Increasingly, couples are choosing to separate later in life, sometimes after decades together, sometimes once the children have left home, and sometimes simply because the relationship has run its course. And while divorce at any stage of life can be difficult, I think divorce later in life does carry its own unique set of emotional, legal, and financial complexities. For many people, it's not just about dividing assets, it's about redefining your identity. It's about protecting retirement security. It's about navigating what is a deeply personal transition with as much dignity and self-care as you possibly can. And I know this chapter personally because I went through a divorce about 5 years ago, and thankfully it wasn't acrimonious. No courtroom battles, no legal warfare over assets or the children or anything like that. But even when things are amicable, it is still one of life's most profound transitions. Of that, there is absolutely no doubt, and I can say it because I've got the scars to prove it. But today we're going to talk about something that doesn't, if we go into it with eyes wide open, have to leave too many deep and indelible scars, hopefully. Joining us today is Gillian Lowndes, who is a director at Lowndes Dlamini Attorneys, one of South Africa's most respected family specialists with more than 2 decades experience helping people through these very difficult transitions. She's also a trained mediator and collaborative divorce practitioner. So what does that mean? Well, it means her work is often about helping families find solutions rather than simply fighting battles in court. And as always, I'm joined by financial planner and life transition guide Kim Potgieter for an in-studio interview for a change. Kim, it feels like it's been a while since we last had you in studio, so good to see you. You're looking well. How have you been?
Thanks very much for having me. I'm pleased to be here with you today.
Now, Jill, great to have you in my studio. And before we dive into the technical side of divorce law, I'd love to start with the human side of the story because, you've had almost 2 decades, in fact, more working in family law. So what have you learned about what people are really going through when they walk into your office for the first time?
Thanks for having me on, Michael. So I actually listened to a very interesting podcast recently, and I think what's going on in the world is very similar to what we see in South Africa. So when people walk into my offices, generally there's a big event that's happened, which has led to a schism in the relationship. But what I have learned over many, many years in practice is the big event is symptomatic of what's been happening over the entire duration of the relationship. And there's a very well-known American divorce lawyer, James Sexton, who he sort of coined the phrase slippage. And I think what happens is, particularly in the first decade of marriages, people forget to talk to one another. They get very caught up in earning money, raising children, and they forget the respect that they once had, the excitement they once had, and gradually they stop communicating, they stop sharing experiences together. They stop those little check-ins, and before you know it, there's either infidelity, or there's a financial crisis, or there's a conversation that just kept getting put off, and then they come to me.
And it sounds so similar to where we were in our marriage, although ours was very early on. But there had been a kind of growing apart and a kind of feeling of charting a different course and not being on this course together. Kim, when you sit down with a client and they're going through a divorce, it's something very personal for you. You've also, walked this road. What is it that tends to lead to this situation where we find ourselves unable to repair a relationship that, we thought when we got into it would be forever after?
So most of the cases that I work with happens to be infidelity that I see many times. But again, as Gillian was saying, that's just something that it ends in, but there was always reasons that it comes to. So whenever I'm working with somebody, they normally are in a very damaged space, if I could say that. It's an incredibly emotional state. There's so many things going on that it's really difficult to do the financial planning. It's really difficult to help them see this world where they are not two people, but now they're one person. And for me, much of my work that I do is creating a safe space where we can actually do a whole lot of emotional work actually before we can get to the finances. And I know they're coming to me for the finances, but at the end of the day, I can never get to the finances without doing the emotional part, just because of the state that they're in when they come.
Do you think, would it be fair to say, Jill, from what you're seeing, is this rise of the so-called grey divorce one of these big trends that we are seeing? In my circle of friends, it does feel like increasingly I'm hearing of couples that had children through high school, now into university, are now getting divorced, which makes it feel like, I don't know what the reasons are, or maybe the marriage may have broken down years ago and you think, well, let's just do it for the kids kind of thing. We'll wait for them to be out of home. Is that a trend that you're seeing, or is it very unscientific research on my part?
So I've found a lot of articles about this. It's not necessarily that grey divorces are the bulk of the divorces that are happening in South Africa. Most divorces are instituted in the 42 to 46 age group. So that's when we're seeing most people instituting divorces. Men around the median age of 46, bearing in mind that's your median. Women around the age of 42. But there is a gradual uptick in those grey divorces. I mean, I hate the term grey divorce because I'm in my 50s and it makes me sound like, Tani Sari on the farm. But I'm in my 50s and the grey divorce is divorces that are instituted 50 and up, the decade 50 to 59 and so on. But Stats SA doesn't give us specific percentages of divorces in particular age groups. What they do tell us is that there is a year-on-year increase percentage-wise in those grey divorces, and then your clever financial journalists unpack that for us in articles. Stats SA doesn't package it and give it, so
right.
As a lawyer I don't have those at my fingertips, but there is an uptick, and I find that those are my most difficult divorces to manage.
Why do you think, if we were to speculate, it's happening more frequently now?
I think there's less of a stigma attached to divorce. So in your younger age groups, people more readily get divorced. In your older age groups, people are cottoning on to the fact that they can if they want to. I think children are leaving home. You've got the empty nest problem. Perhaps there's been slippage over many, many years, and all of a sudden the couple now only has each other. That's it. You wake up in the morning and that is the person that you have to interact with. In circumstances in which you focused on your kids, you focused on work, perhaps you have a little bit more disposable income. You now have the freedom to go and explore different hobbies, different interests, and because of the slippage, possibly because you've grown apart, you do that separately from one another. You don't have any joint goals, common interests, and I think you reach a point where you're done.
Maybe I could just add two more reasons that I see happening, because I see an increase in this a lot. And the one is just the consideration on what age we're going to live till now. So I think many times, because we were so socialized and conditioned into the fact that, we weren't going to live that much longer, people just stayed in it. And now with us having conversations that we're going to live till 100, people are going, well, why would I stay in something that's really not serving me? And then the other one, and it's that big word called menopause. It's that hormonal change that's going on inside of people. And I do see, especially women, getting to a stage where they won't take certain things anymore. And they're going out there and saying, I want this divorce because I no longer want to be treated this way. And I've seen both of those as quite big elements as to why the divorce rate is going up in this age group.
And as we know, Kim, divorce later on in life can make planning really difficult, because I think in my experience, and sample size of one, we didn't have that many assets to haggle over, to be fair, and so when I say ours was quite amicable, I think that did play a big part in it. It's not like you were talking about huge assets built up over a lifetime together, and were you married in community or out of community of property and that kind of thing. From a financial perspective, what are some of the financial shocks that you see people experiencing when this happens?
So I've actually been in a meeting with a couple who had just come in, and we were doing life planning, and right at the end of the life planning meeting, they announced to me that they were going to get divorced. So we'd done the whole meeting, and it was literally in the last 2 minutes. And then it was this course of working with them and unpacking everything over the next few meetings. And they've chosen not to get divorced after that because they realized that financially, by getting divorced, both of them were going to have a life that neither of them wanted. And that shouldn't be a reason for staying together at all. So I'm not using this as a reason. But what I am saying is there's such a wake-up call when you're splitting your money. So you say, oh, well, if you've got a lot of it, it's going to be easy to split it. That's often when I see the hardest decisions being made, because people didn't think when they got married. They're now married in community or property. They are now going to lose all of their assets. And for many people that have accumulated a lot of assets, the assets mean a lot to them. And the thought of giving away half when they have worked so hard for it is huge. So I'm seeing such a mixture in it. And really, it's not so cut and dry that you could say because you've got a lot, it's easier, or because you've got a little, it's easier. It's really, there's all of these other factors. And again, Michael, it comes back to our discussions we've had so often. It's what was your when you were a child, what was your money experiences? Where is it fitting in? How's it actually playing out in your life and your identity? And that's why many people do stay together. That shouldn't necessarily be staying together because they're so taken and it's very hard for them to break this identity of what they've seen for their lives.
Yeah, and I think, again, why, if we were to say, well, what's good advice for young couples getting married is to really put all of this out on the table. You know, what is your connection to money? What are you trying? What are you working so hard, 9 to 5, or for most people it's 8 till 6, 7, 9 in the evening? Why are you doing this? And to better understand that from the get-go, and also what the trade-offs are. Because on the other side, yes, you may have worked very hard to build a career and to acquire assets, and if you did that because someone was at home, you know, looking after the children, doing the school run every day, ensuring that you had a good meal, you know, looking after you, ensuring that you had the base from which to build that accounts for an awful lot as well. And I'm sure, Jill, this is often where we get into the weeds of the arguments or the debates. But from where you're sitting, what are some of the more unique legal or financial complexities that arise when we talk about getting divorced later on in life? I also hate the term grey divorce, although I'm greying around the chin a little bit at the moment.
So, Michael, I think also just to touch on what Kim was saying, she's quite right. It's very, very hard when you get to a certain age to start considering sharing assets, because there's also a cost consequence to sharing an asset, whether it's the sale of a house, whether it's the encashment of a pension interest, even if it is sort of considering whether or not then you have to consider whether or not you've got enough to then live at a certain level going forward. The other aspect, of course, is income. So once you get into your late 50s, your early 60s, most people, if they're employed in a corporate, have to retire at a certain age. And corporates are quite ruthless. If you're not self-employed, you work for a corporate, you're done by 65. Some firms 63, some even 60, and then you have to live off of this pot that you've built up. You've enjoyed a lifestyle together, and you now have to come and sit in a lawyer's office and try and decide how to divide up your money so that you can live with financial dignity going forward. And this is a phrase that I use with a lot of people who come into my office, whether they come in for a mediation, whether they can only afford one lawyer, so they come and see me jointly, which is quite tricky, but it's doable, or whether they come to me as a litigator. And the phrase is, you need to try and achieve a dispensation, an end result where you can live with financial dignity. And I say at the beginning of every meeting, you can either choose to pay me and the advocate that I'm going to brief to go to court for you, and that is going to cost you, in some of these big divorces, millions of rands, or you can actually choose to keep that in your pie and share it. Now, I don't mean to sound flippant, because in some instances it is impossible to mediate or negotiate a divorce, and that's a topic all on its own which could take up an hour. It has to do with a whole plethora of different dynamics that come into the room, which then lead people down the path of litigation. And there's a place for litigation. But if you are able to mediate and if you are able to negotiate, that is obviously, that's the gold standard. Try and do that. But the reality is, if you're coming to me in your 50s or your 60s, you are probably not going to be able to accumulate many more assets over the next 2 decades. You're probably going to be heading for retirement. Your income is going to become investment return income. And your standard of living is going to drop. It's going to take a dip, and you're not going to be able to, unless it's a huge estate. I'm talking about your average person who is, in the majority in this country. You're not going to be able to live at the same standard. And that's what Kim encountered with her couple. They worked out that their lifestyles were going to be so different that they chose the togetherness rather than the divorce, which I think could be a sensible decision, and it could be made for a good enough reason.
Yeah, but tell me about that experience with that couple. You don't have to name them, Kim, but I think that's a very interesting example of approaching this with eyes wide open. As you say, there are circumstances, if there's been embezzlement of funds behind one's back, and maybe one thought one had a shared property and one of the partners went and rebonded and took that money. There are cases where awful things happen, and so sometimes you have to go through the legal process. But it is extremely demanding emotionally as well as financially. So tell me a little bit more about this couple that you advised, Kim.
So what we did to start off with is I gave them each a separate financial planner so that they weren't working with the same financial planner. So they each went to a different financial planner who worked with them about what they wanted their next chapter to look like. So they did that separately. And then what we did is we brought the couple back together to then see what it looked like altogether. Because for us, our goal with our clients is that they leave us with their value systems intact. And that is the biggest thing, that they need to keep their value systems intact. And then secondly, that they're both going to be looked after. And it was really the couple's decision. That can never be our decision. But remember, we take the emotion out of it. We just show them on a piece of paper with all the sums and calculations what it actually means when they split. And then it's really up to them. Obviously, we always would encourage them to get counseling, to do mediation, to put it together. But we sometimes do have happy outcomes. And again, that's not our goal. Our goal is not to keep the couple together. The goal for us is to just show them what the reality is. Because many times what happens when we're going through this transition, first of all, we're so emotional. So we make the worst financial decisions. I've seen people walk out of marriages with nothing just because they're just tired, they're exhausted, and they're emotionally depleted. I've also seen people hang on to marriages and not separate and not get divorced because they're hanging on to that amount of money that they think is their due, and they are not going to let that other person go and enjoy it with somebody else. And I've seen them get destroyed as people. So there is such a balance between this, and that's why, Michael, whoever you're working with is to just really let their situation be what you're doing and not bring all your own ideas in, judgments in, and you have to sit with them, because what works for one couple doesn't work for another couple.
What are some things that people don't tend to think about in the fog of a relationship breakdown, when it is the primary relationship, when you thought it would be happily ever after, and so you are naturally overwhelmed with emotion, and so you're not thinking clearly about, okay, what does the day after look like from a financial perspective? What are those some of those common blind spots?
Well, the one blind spot is walking out with nothing. Because people come in and they're tired, they've had enough, and they just say, well, just give them everything, I'm out of there with nothing. And then for years to come, they've got those, that is their result. And the next one I see is when they start as a couple, really, been disgusting to each other. You know, everything that they did have goes out the window, and now they start using their children in this war against each other. And the repercussions that I see for the children for years to come is huge. So I think that's always got to be taken into account when you're doing all of this. What happens to this family that you've had? Why break them apart? And that's when I see sides come out of people where they will, when I talk about go against their value system, at any cost, they're going to, screw the other partner. And I go, no, but at the end of the day, what we should be doing is again what Gillian's been talking about, having some dignity in all of this, because it's ultimately just money. It's money, but that money represents so much in many of these people's conversations.
Yeah, and I've seen divorces where it's actually so much more than the money. The money is almost used as a weapon, along with weaponizing, the children and rights to the children. It can get really nasty. Let's bring it back maybe to some of the, the legal blind spots as well, that sometimes we may think we understand what the various marriage contracts mean, but I think often we only really read the contracts when the marriage ends or if you're going through a divorce, Jill. So in your experience, what are the biggest misunderstandings people have about marital regimes in South Africa?
So Michael, actually just something that popped into my head while we were speaking earlier and while Kim was speaking. I think the most important thing is for people to have these conversations before they get married. So first of all, get a level of understanding of the different marital regimes. What happens if, for example, you don't sign what we call an antenuptial contract? In the States, they call it a prenup. You're then in the hands of the government, and your marriage would then be in community of property. But generally, when I draft these antenuptial contracts, the couple come to me while they're making decisions about the flavor of their wedding cake, what the bridesmaids are going to wear, the venue, the chairs, or what the cutlery is going to look like. They're under immense pressure. They're about to head off to some wonderful destination, get married, and then go off on honeymoon. And they come screeching into my offices. And what they don't realize is they're about to embark on the divorce before the marriage. The families get involved. Generally, they are probably in their late 20s, early 30s. Generally, people are not getting married as young as they used to. And in fact, marriage rates are declining, which is also interesting. And that's a global phenomenon. People are choosing to live together. And that in and of itself has many consequences depending on where you live. I could get into that, but let me first deal with what I'm
We'll come back to it because I think that is very interesting.
Yes, so the people, they come into my office, and sometimes the one partner has more assets than the other. They haven't had the conversations as to whether that should be our assets, my asset, your asset, and it brings with it a hook. I suppose you could call it a psychological hook. People have grown up in different circumstances. If you've grown up middle class to possibly less money than your partner. Perhaps they grew up in an environment where they had a lot. They traveled extensively with their parents. They enjoyed lavish overseas holidays, and they're marrying a person who didn't have that or didn't have access to that. That person may come in with a level of financial anxiety. And the other person who's going to be married is coming into the room with a kind of, I want to protect what's mine. And these very mature conversations have to happen about what's mine, what's yours, what's ours, and what is our attitude towards money going forward? Do we want to be married in community of property? And then we don't sign a contract. And what does that entail? Everything goes into the joint pot. Everything. Whether a creditor attacks us, whether we get divorced, everything sits in that joint pot. If I go and incur massive liabilities, well, you're on the hook for that as well, because it's all in the joint pot. Or do we get married out of community of property? And then what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours, but for a recent development in the law, which says that the court now has an equitable discretion. It can actually step into the arena after a marriage and decide whether or not there should be some kind of a distribution of assets.
Oh.
Very technical, very new law. I actually did my thesis on this.
Oh, wow.
So I'm quite proud of the fact that it has now become law after many years. Or do we get married with an ANC? And then, well, the ANC says either excluding the accrual, you're out of community, or including the accrual. And what is the effect of the accrual? Now, and I don't know how much detail you want, I'm going to give it to you in 10 seconds. If we get married with the accrual, essentially what it means is what's mine at the beginning of the marriage stays mine. What we make shoulder to shoulder, shoulders to the wheel during the marriage, we share. If I stay at home and look after kids, dogs and cats, and you carry on working and your career progresses, mine doesn't, well, I've also contributed, so I get to share in the growth of your estate as well.
Right.
But if you plunk all of your assets into a trust during the course of the marriage, well, then I might have a problem because our law's not very fair to the spouse who isn't potentially a beneficiary of that trust. It's quite technical, but boy, oh boy, do you have to have your eyes wide open when you go into this and have those awkward conversations. Do you ride horses? How much is that going to cost me as your spouse if you give up working?
Yeah.
For example.
Yeah. And fascinating because, as you say, you could go in thinking that you've got accrual and, it's fair that whatever we had leading into this should be ring fenced and that was yours, but everything we do together and because I stayed at home and I helped you with but if behind your back or unbeknownst to you, your partner has plonked everything into a trust and then you get to this moment and you find, without getting too technical, what does the law tend to say about that if that was done without the spouse's knowledge?
It's interesting law. So before a landmark ruling in the Supreme Court of Appeal, essentially what we as lawyers would plead is this. If the husband treated all of the assets as if they were his own, and he didn't really administer the trust as if it was a trust. There were no meetings of trustees, no resolutions passed. It was basically just kind of set up, parked, and then he did as he pleased. We would say it was a sham. There was never actually a trust, and all of those assets we would plead are his, in his personal estate. If he kind of held meetings of trustees, he passed resolutions, it kind of looked like he was running the trust appropriately. There was an independent trustee, but there was still a level of dealing with certain assets as if they were his own. We would say it's an alter ego, and we can claw out those assets which weren't actually justifiably legally transferred into the trust, and we would then argue that those should fall onto his personal balance sheet, a claw out. But there was a recent decision, not so recent, a couple of years ago, in the SCA where it said, you must now prove that those assets were transferred into the trust with the fraudulent intention to prejudice the other spouse's claim in whatever marital property regime you were married into. Now, fraud carries with it a huge evidentiary burden, and you have to prove that fraudulent intent, which is very, very hard. So now what we're all pleading is that it's unconstitutional and all trust assets should be included in marital property, and there has yet to be a test case. And unfortunately, you need a very strong witness to cope with providing evidence to actually proving their case. And then hopefully changing the law. And also it depends on the side of the divide you're on. I've argued for the spouse who plonked the assets in the trust, and I've argued for the spouse who was left outside of the trust. So it's a tricky one.
Maybe I just want to add on this trust story, two of clients that I've worked with going through divorces just lately. And that has been that they've had family trusts. So when they've married their partner, there's been these family trusts that were set up by the partner's parents. You don't have a claim to those trusts, but they made their whole plan for their lives and their retirement and what they were going to do because of the trust money that they could get. And in both those cases, the partner who wasn't involved in that trust then loses all of that. So you do all your planning as a couple, knowing that money's there for you, but you really have no claim to it. And parents will make sure that the partner that you're divorcing doesn't get a share of that. So just lately, I've seen two of those being part of people's plans, and then they lost everything. But for me, what all of this means is that we should be having regular financial planning conversations as a couple. I'm talking way before divorce. Yeah. So these young couples getting married, those conversations should happen with a non-connected objective person, i.e. I'm always selling financial planning, but a financial planner that you can trust, because when you're having those discussions, you will understand the repercussions. Because many people I know are not a beneficiary of the trust, but they know the trust's happening. They know all of that's happening, but they never want to say to their partner they don't trust them, because if they say to their partner they don't trust them, it breaks down love. So they keep quiet instead, and then what it does is one day, if it doesn't go right, then you can say, oh, I was stupid because I did that. But if you're having regular, even as just a yearly review, you're seeing what all of those parts are to your financial plan. And money is one of the biggest causes of divorce. So for me, if you could start that way, get the right contract, have regular financial planning meetings, I really don't think we would see the divorce rate as high as we do see it. But it's because money's so taboo. We don't talk about it unless we're fighting about it.
Exactly. We're such a conservative society. Have you ever been put in a position, Kim, where you are the financial planner for a couple, and then one of the individual parties in the relationship then approaches you, unbeknownst to the other party, to say, right, I actually want to put all of these assets into a trust, and I want to start planning things slightly differently to what we had agreed when we saw you as a couple. Does that then put you in a hugely ethical bind? And
it is. I mean, we even have clients that will contact us afterwards. They've been in a meeting around their will, and they agree to something, and then we're going to draw up the will, and then one partner comes and says, please, can you change it? So our standard and what we really believe in, we do believe in both parties being in the meetings, because for us, we don't want to be in those situations. But if we do get called afterwards and asked to do this, we insist that the partner tells their spouse. So we don't do it because it's not for us to say it. I mean, obviously we can't, but in the end of the day, we are both of their planners. And so we get the partner to tell them, because otherwise what I think we would do is we'd lose the trust of our clients. And the kind of people we want to work with are the kind of people that would be courageous enough to go and tell their partner what they were doing.
Absolutely. Let's just move it along to retirement savings, which I think are often one of the largest assets in a marriage, especially later on in life, as you've had this retirement pot accumulate and enjoy the eighth wonder of the world in compounding. I think many people don't realize how they're actually treated in divorce. Now we've also got two pot just to complicate things. How often have you seen this crop up in your practice, Kim?
Well, I mean, we know now with the new regulation that we can share that retirement pot, and that is the important part, is that people understand that, because that's, again, many people don't even know what the legislation is. So they're in this situation with their partners. They go through it for years and years on their own, maybe asking a friend here and a friend there, but they don't get the actual advice that they would be all right because they would have claim to the partner's pension fund. And it's really, I think, just get all those facts, like know what it really is. Don't keep working it out yourself year in year on without knowing facts, because most people that I meet do not know the repercussions and what their rights are to those pension funds.
So on that note then, Jill, maybe you can just explain how pension interests are handled in South African divorce law. And you know, it's clear that this often does crop up as a surprise, and sadly often too late.
So it's interesting to me that Kim says people aren't aware of the fact that a pension interest is in fact an asset that can be shared on divorce, because that's been law for decades. And I find it fascinating that people don't realize that. But the wonderful thing about the law, and this is why I actually love what I do, is there is always an opportunity to disagree with a colleague. So I actually had an interesting discussion recently, and I'm sure when my colleagues listen to this podcast, they'll all probably jump on the phone and say, hey, I actually disagree with what you said.
You wouldn't be a lawyer if you didn't disagree. I think it's part of the entrance requirement.
Yeah. And it actually is lovely, because we all just go in and try and bludgeon each other rather than just slowly, gently dripping on a stone, try and change people's views, because we have to, because that's what that's what we built to do. But so in an in-community marriage, assets are shared, liabilities are shared as well, but in its simplest form, that pension interest is a shared asset and you're each entitled to 50%. And generally when you're valuing that asset for divorce purposes, because it's a shared asset, you take it at gross value. Whatever the statement says, that's your value. Then you get to an accrual marriage. You're married in accordance with the accrual system. Now that's a monetary value. So you go in with, for example, a commencement value, which needs to be deducted from your end net asset value on divorce, obviously brought up to date with the current day value of money. But there you don't have a claim to any specific asset. You do have a claim to half of the larger growth in your spouse's estate. So let's say I stayed at home, I looked after the kids, the dogs, the cats, the horses, whatever it is. I gave up my career. I haven't worked for 30 years. I didn't get a tertiary education. I was a secretary when I met my husband, and that's me. And his estate has grown beautifully. And in that estate is a pension interest. Now, I often have this debate with my colleagues. In my view, and there is case law which supports this, when you're valuing his net asset value, you deduct the tax that would be payable on his pension interest.
Right.
So the pension interest has to be valued in accordance with the law on a notional withdrawal basis.
Exactly.
i.e.,
yeah.
if he resigned from the fund, withdrew whatever he could, whatever he can withdraw in cash from the fund, net of tax, is the value that then goes onto his balance sheet for the purposes of calculating the accrual. Now, that can be significantly less than the statement value.
Yeah.
So that's something to just be aware of. Of course, if you married out of community of property, until very recently, you had no claim. Now, the court, if it considers it to be fair and equitable, and if you have contributed to the growth in his estate by being a wonderful spouse, there is a discretion, and the court can order the transfer of assets, but there are hoops you need to jump through.
I was going to ask you how one calculates that value and what the mark-to-market accounting would be. For example, if you're going through a divorce like this now, and you've just seen this huge drawdown in markets because of what's going on in the Middle East, for your financial planning, you would be saying, well, we could ride that out. But if you're now going to calculate a value, how does the timing for that kind of evaluation of what the NAV of the fund, how would that work? Could you come to an agreement that would be agreeable to both parties, where you sit down and say, well, we both lose if we use the NAV now. Should we just wait a little while?
Such a great question, actually. So if you married in accordance with the accrual, what all of the case law says, and this actually went up and down for a number of years, starting with a lovely judgment by Brassey AJ. But now it's settled law. You calculate the value of the accrual as at the date of the divorce, or as close to that date as possible. If, however, you mediate your divorce, most mediators will peg a cutoff date. They'll sit with you in the room and they'll say, what is our cutoff date? And let's agree this early on in the mediation. But just remember, a mediation is without prejudice, and there are no agreements until it has been reduced to writing and signed by both of you. So it's all good and well agreeing a cutoff date in mediation. It's useful if you carry on mediating. It's useful if you reduce it to writing and sign it, but it's of no value if the mediation fails and you then go to court. So you can't really ride out the storm unless you've got a lot of faith in your spouse that you're both going to sort of get divorced at a time when the assets have value.
And you're sitting in that right place where you can have those discussions. So, because many of the people that I work with are not in the right place to even have those discussions. So that's where we always say they sabotage their own financial standing because of it. One thing that I also just wanted to bring in, Gillian, when you were speaking, was very much around, yes, we have this cutoff date and you get this value from the pension fund. But for many people, we talk grey divorces, maybe let's say mid-50s, 55. The spouse's biggest, say you haven't worked, and the spouse's biggest earning capacity will come from the age of 55 to 65.
Yeah.
Yes, you get the pension fund at that time, but you don't get the growth. You haven't worked. You really can't go back to work. I mean, I work with many people trying to give them the confidence that they can go back to work, but their confidence has often been so broken by that time that they can't go back to work. So they lose that whole earning period of the 10 years in the pension fund. And I think it is a reason a whole lot of people don't even get divorced, is because they realize that. So, I mean, marriage is a business transaction as well. And all of those kind of consequences get taken into account. And that's where it is just so difficult.
I do think later on in life we should be better equipped to have these conversations slightly more maturely, but we're human beings, aren't we? That's the one thing, and I see both of you shaking your heads. We don't, sadly.
We're more emotional, Michael.
And especially if you're going through a divorce. We're going to have you back, Jill. Fascinating. There's so much I still want to talk to you about, but sadly we are running out of time. So maybe let's just end on a point around mediation. And from what you've seen and given your experience here, what are the successful ingredients here for mediation to deliver the outcomes that it can deliver, to avoid us from going into the lawfare that can be so destructive?
That's such a great term, lawfare. I like that. I'm going to use it. So in Gauteng, Pretoria and Joburg divisions, there's been a wonderful new directive issued, which says that parties have to at least attempt mediation before the court will give them a trial date. Now, I've been mediating for decades. I was mediating before it was popular, and everybody's now jumping on the bandwagon, and I'm a firm believer in it. I'm going to say something slightly unpopular, though. In these very complicated financial divorces, you have to have a skilled professional attorney or advocate mediator. There are lots of people who are qualifying and accrediting themselves as mediators, but if you don't have the years of experience under your belt, it's very difficult for you as a mediator to help couples navigate a complicated financial divorce. But I'm a firm believer in mediation. I think it is a very valuable first step before you embark upon the lawfare. I think it's something that everybody should try before they have a fight. But one thing I just wanted to say in response to what Kim's been saying often in this discussion, when you're getting divorced, a psychologist once said to me at a wonderful conference, she said, when you are getting divorced, you have the negotiating ability of a 5-year-old. And she didn't say that flippantly. It's almost impossible for people when they're getting divorced without good guidance to make wise decisions because they are psychologically traumatized.
Yeah, your prefrontal cortex, that executive decision-making function of the brain, has been hijacked by all the other negative emotions that come through this. So I think a really great point, and that's where we're going to have to leave it. Jill Lowndes, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure sharing your insights into what is a very difficult life transition, but one that is happening all the more frequently, especially later on in life, here on Life Chapters Money Choices. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Well, divorce is really something people plan for when they stand at the altar, and yet for many people it becomes one of the defining transitions of their lives. I think what today's conversation reminds us is that divorce isn't just a legal event, it is a life chapter in and of itself, one that touches identity, family, finances, and your future in profound ways. But as Jill has so thoughtfully explained, it doesn't have to become a battlefield. With the right legal guidance and honest communication and a willingness to approach the process with dignity, it's possible to navigate divorce in a way that protects not only your financial well-being, but also your values and your relationship. And as Kim often reminds us, every life transition, even the painful ones, creates the opportunity to rewrite the next chapter with intention. If you are going through this stage of life or supporting someone who is, remember that you don't have to do it alone. There are professionals, advisors, and support systems who can help you move forward with a lot more clarity and confidence. My thanks again today to Gillian Lowndes from Lowndes Dlamini Attorneys, and of course Kim Potgieter, whose work continues to help people rebuild their financial lives after life's biggest transitions. If you enjoyed this episode of Life Chapters Money Choices, please subscribe and share it with someone who might find it helpful. Until next time, I'm Michael Avery.